Good afternoon. Welcome to Cool Springs. Today is Wednesday, November the 19th, 2025. And this is part 2 of our midweek study that we've been doing on the Gospel of Matthew, part 2 of chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24 is a chapter that we need to spend a lot of time on because Jesus is with his disciples. They are in Jerusalem. It is the week before Jesus goes to the cross. He's been telling them for months as they were up in the Galilee and then began the journey down to Jerusalem that he has to go to Jerusalem where he's going to suffer and die, and they've had a hard time hearing and accepting that. Along the way, two of the disciples, James and John, the fisherman brothers, who were not only Jesus' disciples, but members of his family. They're his first cousins. They have been prompted by their mama to ask Jesus to guarantee that they'll have the seats of honor at his right and his left hand when he comes into the kingdom. Because what they're doing and what the other disciples are doing is they're wanting to ignore what's in the immediate future. They don't want to hear about the cross and suffering and death. They're wanting to leapfrog over that and get to the good stuff, get to the kingdom, when you're going to be established as the King of the Jews and we're going to help you rule and reign. James and John were jockeying for position. And Jesus had to remind them, gently but firmly, you don't know what it is you're asking for. In order to get those places of honor, you have to be willing to suffer and go through what I'm going to go through. And of course, when the other disciples heard what James and John had requested, they got resentful and they wanted to be mad at James and John because after all, they've all spent the last 3+ years with Jesus. And they can't help but have noticed in all that time that there were occasions when Jesus would take James and John, these two, and Peter, and take them aside privately and let them see things and hear things that the Philips and the Nathaniels and the Andrews didn't get to experience, even though they're part of Jesus' followers too. And because they're now in Jerusalem, and because history is coming to its climax where the plan of salvation that God had come up with from before the foundation of the world is now about to take place. God has come down in flesh. He has lived on planet Earth in human form for the last 30+ years, and now he's about to go to the cross and die for the sins of mankind. They need to be focusing on the sacrifice that Jesus is about to make. They need to understand what their Old Testament scriptures from Genesis through Malachi have been telling them about how mankind can be reconciled to God. But they're wanting to jump right over the cross and get to the kingdom now. And so what's happened in the beginning of Matthew 24 is they're at the temple. And the temple is under renovation. It's been under renovation for decades. It's still under construction when Jesus and his disciples are there. And they're admiring the beautiful buildings and they're admiring the renovation and they're focusing on how pretty this all is, not realizing that this beautiful building isn't going to be standing 40 years from now. That the Romans are going to get fed up with rebellions and they're going to come and knock the whole thing down. No, they're watching the building that hasn't been completed yet. And they're thinking it's going to stand for a long period of time, and they're admiring the beauty. And Jesus tells them, you're focusing on the wrong thing, fellas. You see these buildings? Not one stone is going to be left upon another. And they've left the Temple Mount and the Temple Complex, and they've gone down the very steep Kidron Valley to the east, and they've crossed over, and now they're sitting on the Mount of Olives, And they've got some questions about the end times because Jesus has just told them that there's a period of great suffering ahead. That there's going to be a time when everything you see, this whole religious system that you've been used to, that your ancestors enjoyed in Solomon's day and beyond, that it's all going to go away. And they're having a hard time wrapping their minds around it. So last week when we looked at the first 14 verses of Matthew chapter 24, they've kind of gotten into their heads that, okay, Jesus says there's suffering in the immediate future. We don't like it. We don't understand it. But then he keeps talking about the days that's going to come when there's going to be great tribulation and these beautiful buildings, our whole way of life, are going to be disrupted and gone. What do we do then? The closest that you and I can probably come to that is if you are old enough to remember the events of September the 11th, 2001, when the day before people are going about their lives, they go to bed, they wake up the next morning, and it seems like a normal day, but it's one of those dates that's etched into your memory forever. When the first report came in of a plane, I feel a sneeze coming on here. Excuse me for a second. It'll probably come in a second. First plane hits the first tower, and people are wondering, oh, what a tragic accident. But nobody realized at first that it was no accident, that it was a deliberate attack, that within a matter of minutes, a second plane would fly into the other tower. When people are out there on the street and they're watching the first building burning and they're hearing the sounds of sirens as policemen and firemen and ambulances are rushing to the scene, and they're wondering, oh, what about those people who are in the floors above where we can see the impact of the plane, where we can see the smoke? How are they going to get those people out? How are they going to put the fire out? You know, people were focusing on that. Then the second plane comes in, and it hits the other tower. And in an instant, everything about their focus shifts. They suddenly realize this was no accident. Somebody flew those planes into the buildings on purpose. And again, within a matter of minutes, they hear another plane is hit, and this time it has hit the Pentagon, attacking the very seat of our national defense. And then they hear that there is another plane that's out there, and it appears to be headed toward Washington, and nobody knows who's in charge of that plane. And people are scared, rightfully, and people are trying to respond and figure out, how do we take care of this problem? The disciples, when they're hearing what Jesus is saying about these buildings of the temple that are going to go down, it's a way of life change for them, just like what happened on September 11th was a way of life change for all of us. All of a sudden now, people were having to go through all kinds of screening to get on airplanes. All of a sudden, people are realizing that there's potential for terror attacks in a lot of different ways. And we're going to war. We don't know who we're going to war against yet, but we know we're at war with somebody because somebody planned this on purpose. Jesus is having to tell his disciples there's some troubled times ahead. They're rightly wanting to get details. So they're sitting here on the Mount of Olives, and they ask him 3 questions rolled into one. When will these things, what things? The things he's just talked about. This temple going down. When will these things happen? What's the sign of your coming? Because he keeps telling them that he has to go and that he's going to come again. He hadn't left yet, but they know, okay, somehow he's leaving. And what's going to be the sign of your coming? And what's the sign of the end of the age? And he's been asked those 3 questions rolled into one. And he started to answer them. And in verses 9 through 14, which is the passage we left off with last week, he's telling them that there will be people in charge, rulers, political rulers, and religious rulers, who will deliver you, the audience he's talking to, his disciples, to tribulation, and they'll kill you. And you'll be hated by all nations. Why? Because of my name. He's letting his disciples know you can't leap over the cross, and you can't leap over your destiny. That I'm going to go, and you're going to carry on the work. And they're going to haul you up before courts, and they're going to persecute you, and they're going to hate you, and they're going to do all kinds of evil things against you because you're talking in my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Jesus is having to give them a glance at what is in the immediate future, the cross, what's in the near future. He's going to rise from the grave, ascend back to heaven, and they're going to start spreading the gospel throughout all the nations. Not only to their Jewish people, but to the Gentiles as well. And that because they're spreading the gospel, they're going to come under attack. They're going to suffer persecution. But the gospel's going to spread. And part of what he's telling them is for way, way off in the future, well past their lifetime. When Matthew writes this gospel, he's writing it at least a good 30 to 35 years after he was sitting on the hillside of the Mount of Olives, hearing Jesus in person give this information. And now Matthew can see some of the effects because he's writing this gospel in the late 50s, early 60s of the first century. And he's seeing the gospel start to spread throughout the Roman Empire, composed of Jews and Gentiles. And he's seeing people who are both Gentiles and Jews coming to faith in Christ. And he's also seeing persecution begin to happen. First from the religious leaders in Jerusalem, trying to snuff out all the people who accepted Jesus as Messiah. And now Rome is starting to persecute believers in Jesus because they won't not acknowledge Caesar as God. So Matthew and the other apostles who are alive at this point in time are starting to see part of it, but they're not going to physically live long enough to see the way off in the end times that Jesus also told them about. But Matthew's faithfully recording what he heard, and he's trying to make sense of it for his day and time to do his part in spreading the gospel and to trust God for whatever the future holds for him. By the time Matthew writes Matthew chapter 24, he's already seen at least one of his fellow disciples die a martyr's death. Because James, the brother of John, Jesus' cousin, one of that inner circle group, has already been put to death. It's recorded for us in Acts chapter 12. So Matthew and the other apostles have already seen at least one guy, James, pay with his life for spreading the gospel. It didn't make Matthew or Philip or Andrew or Peter or any of the others quit sharing the gospel. No, they continued. So when he writes this, he's already seeing part of it come true. But there's more that he wants his audience to know. God's got a plan for the entire world. The gospel's got to be preached. And so we pick up with verse 15, which is where Jesus is still talking to Matthew, to John, to James, to Peter, to Andrew, to Philip, to the 12. Right before he goes to the cross. And here's what he's telling these people that he wants them to remember. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then, those who are in Judea, flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. Let me stop right there and we'll comment as we go. Remember, Jesus is sitting on the hillside of the Mount of Olives. He and his disciples can see the Temple Mount. There's a temple standing there. There's the religious structure of Judaism. They're carrying out the sacrifices, their offerings. They're going and they're having praise music being sung in the temple, and they're asking questions in the temple court. And these guys can't think that the day will ever come when all that's going to go away. Even though in their history, they know it's already happened once before. 500 years before they're alive on planet Earth, they know that there used to be another temple standing on that Temple Mount. The one that Solomon had built that people had been worshiping in for 400 years. Until the Babylonians came in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem and flattened the temple complex and carried off a bunch of people into exile for 70 years, and that they had to come back and at first build a small temple that's now being renovated and expanded and improved upon, and they're watching it still under construction, and they can't conceive of it ever going down. Even though they know in history it's happened once, and they know why it happened, because there was a period in their history when the nation wasn't obedient to God, and they kept refusing to do things God's way, and God allowed them to undergo judgment. Now they're with Jesus. And the Matthews and the Philips and the Andrews and the Nathaniels have accepted Jesus as the Messiah. But they're wanting him to set up the kingdom right now. And it's not God's timing. And he's telling them what's going to happen in the immediate future, the near future, and way, way off, well beyond their lifetimes in the end times. And they're trying to make sense of it all. Part of what Jesus has just told them, and the reason I stopped the reading right where I did, he makes reference to a historical event that has already happened. They can read about it in their Bibles. They know that when they were hauled off into captivity in Babylon and the temple was knocked down, Daniel had been reading the book of Jeremiah, and Daniel saw the prophecy that God had given to Jeremiah, saying that your people are going to be in exile for 70 years, but that at the end of the 70 years, I'm going to allow them to go back into the land, and they're going to be able to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, and they're going to be able to rebuild a temple. And Daniel has been reading Jeremiah, and he started to have visions, and he doesn't have anybody to interpret these visions and dreams for him. So Daniel does the only thing that a smart person should ever do. When you don't know what the answer to a problem is, carry it to God. And so in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel starts out by praying and fasting. He doesn't get an instant answer. That's a lesson for you and me. We're we're trained to want everything instantly. In fact, a lot of the things we do now, we expect it to be so instantaneous that even the way things were done 30 years ago are slow and tedious. Take, for example, dial-up internet. When the internet first became available and you had to use a phone and dial up and wait for the signal to connect you and your computer to the web, people thought that was a great thing. But with high-speed fiber optics and the other things that technology has increased to, now anybody with dial-up is a relic, ancient. Using a telephone. We didn't used to have cell phones. It hasn't been that long ago. Most of the people watching this podcast or sitting here in the room today for the live class can remember what it was like before everybody had cell phones. If you're on the road traveling and you needed to call for help, you had to find a payphone somewhere and then find change and go use the payphone to try to make your telephone call. But now everybody's got phones. In fact, some people don't even want to take the phone out of the pocket. They've got the little earbud thing where they can be instantly connected without even having to take the phone out of their pocket to use it. Daniel's day, he's now an old man. He's having visions of the future. And it's a lot of stuff that's technologically way beyond his ability to understand, because it's nothing that he and his world would be familiar with. And he knows God's giving me these visions, so where can I get the answer? From God. And he's been reading the scroll of Jeremiah, and he understands from reading that scroll of Jeremiah that Jeremiah had been told by God, because your people have done this wrong thing, they haven't worshiped me properly, I'm going to take them out of the land and I'm going to leave them out for a specific period of time, 70 years. Why? Because they'd been in the land for 490 years and they had failed to obey God about giving the land its 7th year rest to let the soil replenish. They've been in the land 490 years. If you divide that by 7, you'll get 70. The people weren't obeying God. They weren't letting God's land have its rest. So God came up with an appropriate solution to the problem. I'll take these rebellious people out of the land and give them a timeout until the land has had its Sabbath rests. And then I'll allow them to come back. Daniel understands it. He's an old man now. He knows how old he was when he was carried into captivity as a teenage boy. And now he's a senior adult. And he realizes, oh, it's year 67. The time's almost up for us to be allowed to go back. God's going to keep his word. But I still don't understand these visions that I'm seeing about things that don't make sense to me. I don't have any frame of reference for it. So Daniel chapter 9 opens up with Daniel deciding, I'm going to fast and I'm going to pray and I'm going to focus on God for God to give me the answers I need to all my questions. And he prays for 3 weeks, 21 days. And at the end of that 21 days, Daniel suddenly sees the angel Gabriel appearing before him. And like every other time when an angel shows up, they're very big, they're very scary apparently. Daniel is afraid. He's on his knees and the angel has to tell him to get up. And the angel Gabriel tells him, Daniel, you're highly favored by God. From the minute you started to pray, I've been sent to give you the answer. But Gabriel also tells him that Daniel, there are demonic forces, fallen angels, who tried to obstruct me from coming to give you this answer. And the archangel Michael had to come and withstand them so that I could come in answer to your prayer and tell you what God wants you to know for the future. So Daniel chapter 9 opens up with Daniel praying a barn burner of a prayer, confessing his sins, the sins of his people, and trusting God to answer his prayer, to give him the answers to the things he doesn't understand. And now Gabriel's here, and starting in verse 21 of Daniel chapter 9, Gabriel's going to tell Daniel, here's what's going to happen in the future. And part of what he's going to tell Daniel are things that are going to happen between Daniel's own lifetime and the time that the Messiah comes and will be cut off and have nothing. And for that, I'm going to go to the board for a minute because I need to draw a little timeline here. Here's the timeline of history, and we're going to let it just keep going forward. That was my bad drawing of an arrow. Here's Daniel's lifetime. We're going to put a Star of David right here. This is Daniel's lifetime. When Daniel gets this vision of what's going to happen in the near future and the way off future, and he doesn't understand it. And Gabriel's telling him, Daniel, from the time that a decree is issued to allow for the rebuilding, not of the temple, but of the city of Jerusalem, complete with walls and a moat, from then, and I'm going to put an X mark here on the timeline, from that moment, there will be a period of 7 sevens, the Hebrew word is Shabuas, and 62 sevens. So 7 plus 62. Well, if you do the math and you add that up, that equals 69. He tells Daniel, there are 70 Shabuas, 77s, decreed for your people. And from the time that this decree is issued to rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah comes and will be cut off and have nothing, there's going to be a period of 7 plus 62 equaling 69. Then he's going to go on to tell him that way off in the future, there's going to be another period of 7, the 70th week. And he tells Daniel it's about your people. Who are Daniel's people? The Jews. When Jesus is ready to go to the cross, and Matthew is hearing Jesus talk about the answer to these questions. When will these things, this knocking down of the temple, happen? What's the sign of your coming and the sign of the end of the age? Matthew's right over here. Let me use a different color real briefly. We'll use a little red color here. Matthew and his buddies are right here. And part of what Jesus tells them is, when you see the abomination of desolation as spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Well, what he's just done there is Jesus has just affirmed that we can trust what's written in the book of Daniel about the future. Daniel is going to die. He won't live to see this event. It's recorded for us in the book of Nehemiah, when Nehemiah is serving a future Persian king, because the Babylonians have been conquered by the Persians, and a Persian king is going to let the Jewish exiles go home. Nehemiah is going to be a cupbearer, a servant to the Persian king. He's going to hear about the people who've gone back from exile and how they're in troubled times, that they're subject to a lot of crime because their city doesn't have walls, because the walls got knocked down way back here in Nebuchadnezzar's time. And the Persian king is going to give Nehemiah permission to go back and rebuild those walls around the city of Jerusalem. So when we're reading Ezra and Nehemiah in our Bibles, we can see what Daniel didn't understand, what the 7 was and what the 62 equaling 69 are. That there would be a period of time when the decree is issued to go back and rebuild, and they'll start, but they'll come under foreign opposition, and some false accusations will be made, and the king will order the work stopped for a while until he has time to check things out. And when he discovers these are false charges, he'll allow the work to go forward again. From the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, that there would be this period of 69 periods of 7. The people who were in Jesus' day knew when the decree was issued. It's ancient history to them. They can count. They know it's about time for Messiah to come. That's why when you're reading in the New Testament that people were anticipating and looking forward to searching for the Messiah, it's because they understood the prophecy that had been revealed to Daniel, that it was about time for Messiah to show up. And so they're just having to look around to see, is Jesus this Messiah or is it somebody else? But they also know something else that happened in their history, and we'll take the green crayon for that one, that about 200 years before, the Persians were overcome by the Greeks, and the Greeks were in control of Jerusalem, and there was a Greek king, and I'll just put an asterisk here on the calendar, and I'll write about 200. It's really 168 to 165 BC when this happens. There is a Greek king by the name of Antiochus IV. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, a word that means God manifest. The guy had a serious ego. I'm the king of Greece. I'm in charge of these people. I am God in the flesh. He had that kind of an attitude. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, God manifest. The people called him Antiochus Epimanes, which means crazy dude. Antiochus is going to be in charge of Jerusalem. He's going to order the people to do a lot of things to adopt the Greek culture. He's going to forbid them from circumcising their male babies. If somebody does, they'll kill both the baby and the parents. And he's going to set up a statue of Zeus, one of the Greek gods, in the very Holy of Holies. When Antiochus does this, and remember it's within 200 years of Jesus coming, it's about 168 BC. When Antiochus continues to persecute the Jews and starts to really come down on them and puts that statue of Zeus inside the Holy of Holies in the rebuilt temple, and when he has a pig, which was an unclean animal, sacrificed on the altar, the people revolted. They decided, we have had enough. It is time to rebel. And so they had an uprising, an insurrection against Antiochus, and they kicked him out, kicked the Greeks out. And shortly thereafter, the Romans came in and conquered them, which is why when you open up the New Testament, Caesar and the Romans are in charge. When Jesus is sitting here on the Mount of Olives and he's explaining to his disciples the answers to their questions, and he refers to Daniel, he lets them know that way off in the future, because he tells them, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, then you flee. Here's why I went to this effort to give you this historical information, because it's not in most Protestant Bibles. Because this is recorded for us in the book of Maccabees, which we can find in Catholic Bibles, but we won't find them in Protestant Bibles, and there's some good historical information in there. When Jesus tells them, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, they know about this historic event. It happened after Daniel's time, but before their time. It's a foreshadowing. It's an event that happens once that's going to happen again. The second time that it's going to wind up happening is going to be right here in the halfway mark of Daniel's 70th week. And the reason I have these 3 hash marks here, if you've studied any of our other Bible studies, you know that's our symbol for what most people call the tribulation, but biblically it should be Daniel's 70th week. It's a period of 7 total years broken into two equal halves of 3.5 years and 3.5 years. There's going to be a world ruler coming into power who's going to commit an abomination of desolation in a rebuilt temple. When Jesus is over here talking to his disciples, he's making reference to this future event. There are some religious groups within Christianity who say that everything prophetic that was done in the Bible happens by the year AD 70 when temple number 2 gets knocked down. One more colored crayon here. And we'll put a building here, and then we'll just put a big X through it. Temple getting knocked down in AD 70. There are some people who are going to try to tell you that everything prophetic in the Bible happened by this period of time. But not if you pay attention to the text of what Jesus told his disciples is going to happen. Because not everything that's described happens during this frame. No, when Jesus is sitting here on the Mount of Olives, and he's telling them, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, they've got this historical event in the past. They know about it. There's going to be another one in the future. And they know it's a future event because Jesus tells them it's a future event. Now we go back to the table, and we pick up again with the reading in Matthew 24. Because Jesus had told them, verse 15, when you see the abomination spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then, that's a time reference, those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop, don't go down to get things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. In other words, you see the disaster, run for your lives. It's not like when people are preparing for, say, an approaching hurricane, and they've got plenty of advance warning that a hurricane is coming, so they have to try to board up their houses and take the people and the pets and the food and the medicines and the clothes that they think they'll need for a period of time and flee to an area that they don't think is going to be impacted by the floodwaters and the winds, and then come back and take care of whatever storm damage afterwards. No, this is a case of, when you see this disaster happening, you need to flee to the mountains. Run for your lives. In AD 70, when the Romans knocked down that second temple, Jews were banned from Jerusalem. But they just went to other parts of the Holy Land itself and other parts of the Roman Empire. Whoever is in the field must not return to get his cloak. But woe to you who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. Why the winter or the Sabbath? Winter's a rainy season. Tough to move around, mud, rising floodwaters, and the Sabbath, they were not supposed to break the Sabbath by going more than a Sabbath day's journey anywhere. He's telling them, whenever this world event happens, it's a case of you need to pray that it's not going to happen in the wintertime or on the Sabbath. For there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Verse 21 there is part of the knocking down of the preterist argument that, anything prophetic happened by AD 70. Yeah, AD 70 was bad for the Jews. The Romans killed a lot of people. They scattered Jewish people throughout the Roman Empire. But we're here in the 21st century, and we can look back and say there have been other disasters on planet Earth that were bigger and worse than this one. We can look at times of famine, pandemics, world wars, the Holocaust. What was Jesus saying in verses 20 and 21? there'll be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred from the beginning of the world and until now, nor ever will. What happened in AD 70 was bad. Tragic for the Jewish people. But there have been other tragedies since then, and what's really being described is what's going to happen here in the tribulation period, in Daniel's 70th week, when the whole world will undergo wrath of God, the sealed judgments, the trumpet judgments, the bowl judgments. There's going to be a time of world distress that'll be worldwide, not just confined to the area around Jerusalem. You see, if you lived in the first century and you were in, say, Rome, or maybe Alexandria, Egypt, or even Babylon, what happened in Jerusalem to the Jewish people was bad, but it didn't affect your daily life in Rome or in Babylon or some other place. When these events happen, it's going to be worldwide in nature. Jesus goes on to say in verse 22, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, and you might want to circle the word elect because that comes up a lot when we're talking about end time prophecy, who the elect are, those days will be cut short. I'll give you the Reader's Digest condensed version. The elect in this day and time that Jesus is talking about are the Jewish people. Not Gentile people who've become Christians in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 15th, 20th, 21st centuries. It's the Jewish people. We've covered that in our Revelation course in detail. I'm not going to teach Revelation all over again. I'm just wanting you to observe the details here about what Jesus is talking about. He is giving an end times bit of information to his disciples. Then, you'll notice in verses 15 through 22 there are several time references. Therefore, when, that's a time reference in verse 15. Verse 16, then, sequentially lets you know what's coming after what happened in 15. Verse 21, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as not has occurred since the end of the world, since the beginning of the world, time reference, or until now, time reference, nor ever will, another time reference. Verse 22 and 23 there, but for the sake of the elect, those days, the days when this tribulation is going to happen, will be cut short. God will set a time limit on it. Verse 23 has another time reference. Then, when these days are being cut short, then, if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. And verse 24 there is another clue that it didn't all happen by AD 70. The Romans knocked down the temple in AD 70. And yeah, they kicked the Jews out of the city of Jerusalem. But they left them within the country, within the Roman Empire, within places like Galilee and Samaria and Judea. But the clue here is about these false Christs and false prophets arising and showing great signs and wonders. AD 70 through the end of the 1st century, they weren't showing great signs and wonders. Who's speaking here? Jesus is. This is reserved for what's going to happen during Daniel's 70th week, when the Antichrist and his false prophet are going to be deceiving the whole world about who the Messiah is and demanding that they worship the wrong God instead of the right God. Verse 25, behold, I, and the I speaking there is Jesus, behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. or behold, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man, and Son of Man is capitalized there because that's Jesus talking about himself, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. But immediately, that's a time reference, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun, S-U-N, meaning that big orb of plasma that's 93 million miles from us that we orbit around, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then, another time reference, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth. You see, when AD 70 happens, yeah, people in the Roman Empire hear about it, and maybe a few people outside of the Roman Empire, like Babylon, would have heard about it, but not the entire world, because the people in the first century didn't even know that there were people living over here in our Western Hemisphere, that there were tribes of people throughout North, Central, and South America. What is Jesus describing here? He's describing, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. For verse 31 there, let me give you two cross-references. Isaiah chapter 27 and Ezekiel chapter 11. Now let me go back to the board for a minute and try to give you the big picture scope. Jesus is standing or sitting here. He's talking with his disciples. It's right before he goes to the cross. And the questions they're asking him are about when he's coming back, because he's about to leave them, and about the signs of the end of the age. Well, the age of the earth didn't end in AD 70. As we just described, some of the things that Jesus himself said didn't happen when the Romans knocked down Temple number 2 and scattered Jews throughout the Roman Empire 21 centuries ago. When he talks about the sun turning dark and the moon to blood, these are events that are going to happen during this Daniel 70th week. We have the Revelation overview course that breaks into detail the 7 seal judgments sequentially, the 7 trumpet judgments sequentially, and the 7 bowl judgments. The seals and trumpets happen during the first half of Daniel's 70th week. The bowl judgments, and the first bowl judgment is that mark of the beast being imposed, which happens right after this halfway point, until the Son of Man returns and sets up his kingdom, because they wanted to know about the kingdom. If you're having a conversation with somebody who is a preterist and they're trying to tell you that all these things prophetically happened by AD 70 and that it's all symbolic or allegorical and can't be taken literally, what they'll also tell you is that we're living in the kingdom right now. Hello? Can you read your Bible? Are we living in a kingdom where Jesus is ruling? Where people are following God's law? Is there any place on planet Earth where people are following God's law and living just to please Him? No. There's trouble. There's wars. There's earthquakes. There's famines. There's all kinds of deception and all kinds of backstabbing, and people are calling evil good and basically saying that if you believe in the Bible that there's something wrong with you, and they're trying to tell you even basic things that you know to be true. That people are born either male or female. There are people who tell you that they're furries, that they've adopted some sort of animal thing. They're thinking that, but that's not who they are. Biologically, they're either XX, female, like me, or they're XY, male, with male body parts. This is not the kingdom right now. People are confused. People are wicked. People are flaunting their sin. What we have to do is carefully observe the text of Scripture. And to not read into it what we've always heard or what somebody's book or some popular preacher has told us is the truth. We need to examine the Scriptures for ourselves and take notes and go where the facts take us. And so this is Jesus talking. So he's not answering his disciples' questions with allegories and symbolism. They've asked him an important series of questions. When's this temple going down? When are these things happening? What's the sign of your return and of the end of the age? And he's answering their questions, and he's giving them literal answers. Yes, some of them, we know for sure that John, the beloved disciple, is going to still be alive to see the temple go down in AD 70 because he's going to write his Gospels and his letters and the book of Revelation in the 80s and 90s, some 25 to 30 years after the temple goes down. Jesus is giving them, here's some near future stuff, and here's some way off in the future details. And so for time's sake tonight, I'm going to just go ahead and read through verses 29 through 31 again and remind you this is Jesus talking so that you can go back yourself and go, did that happen in AD 70? No. And if not, then you don't listen to the idea that, oh, this stuff is all symbolic and not meant to be taken seriously. You take God's word seriously because it's coming straight from the mouth of God in this case. When we're reading, for example, the book of Joel, people can argue as to whether or not Joel is saying what God told him to say or whether Joel is putting in his own thoughts. Matthew was sitting there listening to Jesus in person. And Matthew is quoting God in the flesh. And God in the flesh is telling you something, and you need to know what God is saying and go with God. So verses 29 through 31, and then next week there'll be a part 3, because like I said, this is an important chapter, and we need to make sure we get it right. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken. Over the period of time between the time Jesus said those words and, say, AD 70, there have been some astronomical signs. There have been eclipses and that sort of thing. But Jesus describes a whole list of things, and you need to go check, 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 check. And they all didn't happen in that immediate period. They're going to happen during that Daniel 70th week. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. That didn't happen in AD 70. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. That didn't happen in AD 70 either, because like I said, there were parts of the world that Matthew and everybody else who lived in first century Roman world didn't even know existed. But this is Jesus talking. He says, all the tribes of the world. That meant like the Aztecs and the Incas and the Cherokee and the Sioux in this part of the world that those people didn't even know existed. They're going to have to mourn too. It's going to be a worldwide event, not a regional event. All the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds in the sky with power and great glory. When this event happens at the very tail end of Daniel's 70th week, the entire world will see Jesus showing up, coming from heaven with his white-robed armies, as is described in Revelation. Didn't happen in AD 70, still future to our time. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. One of those judgments, trumpet judgments, will be the loud voice, the angel voice from heaven proclaiming God's judgment on the earth during Daniel's 70th week. And God will be gathering up his elect, some of whom will be down here on planet Earth who have become believers during Daniel's 70th week. And that armies of white-robed people following behind Jesus as he returns will include all the believers who either died or were part of the rapture generation. They're coming from heaven back down to earth to set up that literal 1,000-year described for us in Revelation chapter 20 millennial reign where Christ is ruling and reigning here on earth from Jerusalem. It's not allegorical, it's not symbolic. You're certainly not living in the kingdom of God now. If we're living in the kingdom of God right now with all the sin that's in this world, then we've been sold a bad bill of goods. Nope, that interpretation is wrong. Jesus is returning. He hasn't done it yet, but he is returning. He will set up a literal 1,000-year here on planet Earth kingdom where he will rule and reign with David underneath him and with believers ruling and reigning on the earth until the 1,000 years are completed, at which time Satan will be released from the abyss for a short period of time to try to lead one last battle, which Satan and his forces will lose. Then there will be the great white throne judgment, followed by the new heavens and new earth. If you want to go into much more detail than we're going to be able to do in this course, we have a course that's on our YouTube page called God's Plan of the Ages. You can watch those videos, and this will bring it out into greater detail for you. So tonight we're gonna cut off Matthew chapter 24, part 2, with verse 31, and next week we'll finish up going from verse 32 to 51. You want to go ahead and reread that again, and you may want to do the cross references to Isaiah 27, Ezekiel 11, and also, I would add to it now, Revelation chapter 20, where the millennial kingdom and the great white throne are discussed. See you next week. Thanks for watching.